Her steps were slow but deliberate, each one a testament to a life lived in pursuit of the very right she now sought to exercise. An elderly black woman, her silver hair a crown of wisdom, approached the polling station only to be met by the aggressive impatience of a young cop. He shoved her, a brutal act of disrespect. He saw only an old woman, an inconvenience. He had no idea he had just assaulted a living legend of the civil rights movement, a woman whose quiet courage had once moved mountains and was about to bring an avalanche down on him. Welcome, everyone, to a story that resonates with the echoes of history and the enduring fight for dignity. Today we explore a moment where arrogance clashed with an unseen legacy, reminding us that true strength often lies in the quietest courage. If narratives of justice, resilience, and the unyielding power of the human spirit are what you seek, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Your support amplifies these vital stories. We're grateful you've chosen to join us for this journey into a day that started with a vote and ended with a reckoning. The morning air in the city of Oak Haven still held a crisp autumn chill, but inside the gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School, transformed for the day into Precinct 12's polling station, a different kind of tension hummed. It was Election Day, the culmination of a particularly contentious local campaign, and the lines of voters snaked out the door, a testament to the community's engagement, but also a breeding ground for frayed nerves and impatience. Amidst this bustling civic duty, Mrs. Augusta Gus Mayfield made her way with a quiet, unhurried dignity that seemed to create a small pocket of calm around her. At 82 years young, her steps were measured, aided by a polished oak cane her late husband, a master carpenter, had carved for her decades ago. Her silver hair was neatly coiffed, her tweed coat buttoned against the morning air, and her eyes, though softened by age, still held a spark of the indomitable spirit that had defined her extraordinary life. To most of the younger poll workers and many of the voters in line, Mrs. Mayfield was simply a familiar, respected elder from their community, perhaps a retired teacher or a church grandmother. They knew her gentle smile, her kind words, her unwavering presence at community events. Few, if any, in that bustling gymnasium knew the full breadth of her history, the battles she had fought, the dangers she had faced, the sacrifices she had made so that they and she could stand in that line today. Augusta Mayfield was not just a voter. She was a living, breathing monument to the civil rights struggle. In her youth, she had marched alongside giants, organized voter registration drives in the Deep South under the constant threat of violence, faced down police dogs and fire hoses, and spent nights in jail cells for daring to demand equality. Her name was etched in the annals of the movement, a quiet hero whose courage had helped to dismantle the very barriers that had once made a scene like this, black and white citizens voting side by side, an impossible dream. She rarely spoke of those days, not out of modesty, but because for Gus, the struggle was ongoing, the work unfinished, and the act of voting was not just a right, but a sacred, hard-won duty. Her hidden power was not a title or a position of current authority, but the immense moral weight of her past, the deep well of respect she commanded from those who knew her story, and the network of influential figures, politicians, activists, community leaders, whom she had inspired, mentored, or fought alongside. It was a power that lay dormant, unseen by the casual observer, but capable of being awakened with devastating force if provoked by an injustice that echoed the very tyrannies she had dedicated her life to combating. Presiding over the sometimes chaotic scene at the polling station entrance, attempting to manage the long lines and ensure order, was Officer Chad Baxter. Baxter was young, barely in his late 20s, with a physique honed more by gym workouts than by street experience, and an attitude that far outstripped his years on the Oakhaven Police Department. He was known for his short temper, his impatience, and a tendency to escalate situations with an unnecessary show of aggression. He viewed his role on Election Day not as a facilitator of democracy, but as a bouncer at an unruly club, quick to assert his dominance, particularly over anyone he perceived as challenging his authority or slowing things down. He had a particular disdain for what he considered complainers, and seemed to take a perverse satisfaction in making people feel small. He had received several informal complaints for his brusque manner, but nothing had ever stuck. He was adept at towing the line just enough to avoid serious repercussions, his actions often dismissed as youthful overzealousness. Mrs. Mayfield, having waited patiently in line for nearly an hour, finally reached the check-in table. There was a minor confusion with her registration. A poll worker, new and flustered by the morning rush, couldn't immediately find her name on the precinct roster, perhaps due to a slight misspelling or a clerical error. Mrs. Mayfield remained calm, offering her full name and address again, her voice soft but clear. Officer Baxter, who had been hovering nearby, his irritation visibly growing with every perceived delay, now stomped over. He saw not a respected elder patiently trying to resolve a minor issue, but an obstacle, another problem holding up his efficient management of the line. His ingrained biases, which often equated age with incompetence and blackness with potential trouble, were already priming him for a confrontation. The quiet dignity of Mrs. Mayfield was about to collide with the brash arrogance of Officer Baxter, and the foundations of Precinct 12 were about to tremble. The polite murmur of the polling station, the rustle of paper, the low hum of conversation, the click of voting machines, was shattered by Officer Chad Baxter's impatient sigh, a sound loud enough to make several nearby voters turn their heads. He shouldered his way to the check-in table, his presence immediately ratcheting up the tension. The young poll worker, a college student named Sarah, looked even more flustered under his imperious gaze. "What's the hold-up here?" Baxter demanded, his voice unnecessarily sharp, his eyes flicking dismissively over Mrs. Augusta Mayfield. "We've got a line out the door. People are waiting. Can't you find her name, or is there a problem?" Mrs. Mayfield, though startled by his abrupt intervention, maintained her composure. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice calm and steady. "There just seems to be a slight discrepancy with my registration. We're trying to resolve it." "A discrepancy?" Baxter repeated, his tone laced with suspicion. He leaned over the table, peering at the poll worker's laptop screen, as if expecting to find evidence of some nefarious plot. "You sure you're in the right precinct, ma'am? You sure you're even registered to vote?" The questions were accusatory, his implication clear. She didn't belong. She was causing trouble. "Young man," Mrs. Mayfield began, her voice still soft, but now carrying a hint of steel, "I have been voting in this precinct for over 50 years, likely longer than you have been alive. I assure you, I am in the right place, and I am most certainly registered." Baxter visibly bristled at her gentle rebuke. He didn't like being addressed as young man, especially not by an elderly black woman he had already mentally categorized as a nuisance. His face tightened. "Well, your 50 years of voting don't seem to be helping this young lady find your name, do they?" He turned to the intimidated poll worker. "What's the name again?" Sarah, the poll worker, stammered, Mayfield, Augusta. I'm checking for variations, sir." "Augusta Mayfield," Baxter mused, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. "Doesn't ring a bell. Look, if you can't find her, she needs to step aside. Let the actual voters through. She can go down to the Board of Elections, sort it out there if she's so keen on voting." He gestured dismissively towards the exit. Mrs. Mayfield's eyes, which had seen down governors and sheriffs in her day, narrowed slightly. "Officer, I am not stepping aside. I have waited patiently in line. I am a registered voter in this precinct, and I intend to cast my ballot here today. There are provisions for situations like this. A provisional ballot, if necessary. I know my rights." Her quiet, firm assertion of her rights seemed to enrage Baxter further. He saw it not as a legitimate claim, but as defiance, as a challenge to his authority. "Oh, you know your rights, do you?" he sneered, stepping closer to Mrs. Mayfield, his posture becoming more aggressive, more intimidating. "Well, I know my job, and my job is to maintain order and keep this line moving. And you, ma'am, are currently obstructing that." "I am doing no such thing," Mrs. Mayfield stated, her voice unwavering, though she clutched her oak cane a little tighter. "I am attempting to exercise my fundamental right as a citizen. It is this young lady's job," she gestured politely to Sarah, "to assist me, and it is your job, officer, to ensure a safe and respectful environment for all voters, not to intimidate them." The directness of her statement, the unshakable dignity with which she spoke, seemed to snap something in Officer Baxter. His face flushed an ugly crimson. He was used to people cowering to his uniform and his aggressive demeanor, silencing dissent. This elderly woman, with her calm voice and her talk of rights, was an affront to his inflated sense of power. "That's it!" Baxter suddenly barked, his voice startlingly loud. "You're causing a disturbance. You're agitating other voters. I'm ordering you to leave the premises now." He took another menacing step towards her. Mrs. Mayfield stood her ground. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. "I will not leave, officer, until I have cast my vote or have been provided with a lawful reason and a legitimate provisional ballot." What happened next was shocking in its brutality and its utter senselessness. Officer Baxter, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and perhaps a panicked realization that he was losing control of the situation, in front of an increasingly attentive audience of voters, reached out and shoved Mrs. Augusta Mayfield. It wasn't a gentle nudge, not an accidental brush. It was a deliberate, two-handed shove to her shoulder, forceful enough to send the 82-year-old woman, frail but unbowed, stumbling backward several steps. Her polished oak cane clattered loudly to the gymnasium floor. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden sharp pain, not just physical, but the deeper pain of a profound public humiliation, a violation that echoed the worst days of the struggles she thought were long past. The polling station fell into a stunned, horrified silence, broken only by Mrs. Mayfield's soft gasp and the clatter of her fallen cane. Officer Baxter stood there, chest heaving, his face still flushed, a look of vicious, triumphant satisfaction momentarily flashing in his eyes before being quickly replaced by a flicker of something else, perhaps the dawning, terrifying realization of the enormity of what he had just done. The clatter of Mrs. Augusta Mayfield's oak cane on the polished gymnasium floor was like a starter pistol firing in a library, shockingly loud, utterly out of place, and a signal that something irrevocable had just occurred. For a heartbeat, the entire polling station seemed to hold its breath. Voters in line froze mid-conversation. Poll workers stared, aghast. The low hum of civic duty was replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. Mrs. Mayfield, though she had stumbled, had managed to keep her feet, her hand pressed to her chest where Officer Baxter had shoved her, her face pale, but her eyes, even in that moment of shock and pain, blazing with an incandescent righteous fury. Officer Baxter, his chest still heaving, seemed to realize the gravity of his assault almost immediately. The fleeting look of vicious triumph in his eyes was quickly doused by a wave of what looked like panic. He had crossed a line, a very public line, and the sea of shocked faces staring at him was a testament to that. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a clumsy justification, perhaps to double down on his aggression, but no words came out. It was Sarah, the young, flustered, parasol-eared poll worker, who reacted first. "Oh, my God!" she cried, rushing from behind the check-in table towards Mrs. Mayfield. "Mrs. Mayfield, are you all right?" She bent to retrieve the fallen cane, her hands trembling. Several voters in line also surged forward, their initial shock giving way to outrage. "Hey, what do you think you're doing, officer?" a tall man in a construction jacket yelled, his voice booming through the silent gym. "You can't just shove an old lady like that. What's wrong with you?" "That was assault," a woman with a stroller chimed in, her voice sharp with indignation. "We all saw it. She wasn't doing anything." The atmosphere in the polling station had transformed in an instant from one of mild, orderly frustration to one of simmering, collective anger. Officer Baxter, now looking less like an enforcer and more like a cornered animal, began to bluster. "She was causing a disturbance. She refused a lawful order to leave. I used necessary force to maintain order." His voice lacked conviction, his eyes darting nervously towards the growing crowd of angry voters. Mrs. Mayfield, though clearly shaken, straightened herself with a visible effort, her innate dignity reasserting itself. She took her cane from Sarah, her hand trembling slightly but her grip firm. "Officer Baxter," she said, her voice low but carrying clearly through the now murmuring room, "your definition of necessary force is, I suggest, tragically flawed. You assaulted an elderly citizen who was attempting to exercise her constitutional right to vote. There were witnesses, many witnesses." Her gaze swept across the faces of the other voters, many of whom nodded in agreement, their expressions grim. A young man near the front of the line, who had been quietly filming the entire exchange on his smartphone, now held his phone up more overtly. "Yeah, we saw it, officer," he said, his voice steady, "and I've got it all on video." Baxter's face went a shade paler. The presence of a recording, irrefutable digital evidence of his assault, clearly rattled him. He started to stammer, "Now look, there's no need to... This is being blown out of proportion." But the tide had turned. The initial shock had galvanized the onlookers. They were no longer passive observers. They were a chorus of condemnation. An older gentleman, impeccably dressed, stepped forward. "Officer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of quiet authority, "I am Harold Jenkins, a retired attorney, and I can assure you what I just witnessed was not maintaining order. It was a clear case of battery and a gross abuse of your authority. I would advise you to call your supervisor immediately." The mention of a supervisor, the realization that this was escalating beyond his control, seemed to further unravel Baxter. He fumbled for his radio, his hands visibly shaking. "Dispatch," he said, his voice cracking. This is Officer Baxter at Precinct 12. I need a supervisor on site. We have a situation." While Baxter was on his radio, Mrs. Mayfield, supported by Sarah and Mr. Jenkins, the retired attorney, moved to a nearby chair. She was clearly in some discomfort, rubbing her shoulder, but her eyes were resolute. She looked at the faces around her, the concern, the anger on her behalf. A small, weary smile touched her lips. She had seen this before, this spontaneous eruption of collective conscience in the face of injustice. It was a power she knew well. The situation, as Baxter had so inadequately described it, was about to become far more than he could have ever imagined. The young man with the smartphone was already uploading his video to social media. Calls were being made from within the polling station, to local news outlets, to community activists, to city council members. The name Augusta Mayfield, a name that had perhaps faded from the headlines but still resonate deeply within the city's black community and among those who knew their civil rights history, was about to be spoken again, not in hushed, reverent tones, but as a rallying cry. Officer Chad Baxter, in his arrogant ignorance, had not just shoved an elderly voter. He had poked a sleeping giant, and the rumblings of its awakening were already beginning to shake the foundations of Oak Haven City Hall and its police department. The rising action was swift, fueled by digital witness and a community's outrage, all centered on the quiet, indomitable figure of a civil rights legend he had dared to lay hands on. The arrival of Sergeant Miller, no relation to the officer from Story 14, but a seasoned, no-nonsense supervisor at the Lincoln Elementary polling station, was met with a scene of barely suppressed chaos and palpable anger. Voters were openly berating a pale and shaken Officer Baxter. The young poll worker Sarah was tending to Mrs. Mayfield, who, though composed, was clearly in discomfort. The young man with the smartphone was providing his details to Mr. Jenkins, the retired attorney, who was meticulously taking notes. Cell phones were out everywhere, some still recording, others furiously texting and posting. "Baxter, what in the blazes is going on here?" Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the din, his expression a mixture of exasperation and dawning alarm. He had been briefed by dispatch about a disturbance involving an officer and an elderly voter, but the reality was far more charged than he had anticipated. Officer Baxter, visibly relieved to see his supervisor, but still terrified, launched into a rambling, self-serving account. "Sarge, this woman, she was being disruptive, refusing to leave, causing a scene, holding up the whole line. I asked her repeatedly to step aside. She became agitated, belligerent. I had to use minimal force to de-escalate the situation and maintain order." "Minimal force? You shoved an 82-year-old woman to the ground, you thug!" the man in the construction jacket roared, stepping forward again, only to be gently restrained by Mr. Jenkins. "That's not what happened, Sergeant." Sarah, the poll worker, interjected, her voice trembling but clear. Mrs. Mayfield was being perfectly calm. He was the one yelling. He was the one being aggressive. She just wanted to vote. There was a small issue with her registration, and he lost it and pushed her for no reason. Sergeant Miller looked from Baxter's increasingly desperate face to the composed, dignified figure of Mrs. Mayfield, then to the chorus of angry voters, all seemingly corroborating Sarah's account. He was an experienced officer. He knew a bad scene when he saw one, and this was rapidly deteriorating into a public relations and legal catastrophe for the department. He also noticed the smartphones, many still pointed in their direction. "All right, Baxter, step away," Sergeant Miller ordered, his voice tight. "Go wait by the entrance. Don't talk to anyone." He then approached Mrs. Mayfield, his demeanor respectful. "Ma'am, I am Sergeant Miller. I am so sorry for what you've experienced here today. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "Thank you, Sergeant," Mrs. Mayfield replied, her voice a little weak but her gaze steady. "I believe I am bruised and certainly shaken, but I do not think I require an ambulance at this moment. What I require, however, is to cast my vote, and I require an assurance that Officer Baxter will be held accountable for his unprovoked assault and his attempt to disenfranchise a citizen." It was at this moment that a new figure pushed through the crowd. It was Councilwoman Angela Ramirez, who represented this district. She was a young, dynamic Latina politician, a rising star in city politics, known for her fierce advocacy for civil rights and police reform. She had been making the rounds of polling stations in her district and had received a frantic call from one of her aides about the incident at Lincoln Elementary. "Augusta, my God, Augusta, are you all right?" Councilwoman Ramirez exclaimed, rushing to Mrs. Mayfield's side, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten in her genuine shock and concern. She knelt beside Mrs. Mayfield, taking her hand. The use of her first name, the clear, deep affection and respect in the councilwoman's voice, sent a ripple of surprise through those onlookers who didn't know Mrs. Mayfield personally. This was clearly not just any elderly voter. Officer Baxter, who had been sulking near the entrance, watched this exchange with growing horror. A city councilwoman on a first-name basis with the woman he had just assaulted. His situation was deteriorating even more rapidly than he could have imagined. "Angela, dear," Mrs. Mayfield said, a faint smile touching her lips despite her pain. "How kind of you to come. I seem to have encountered a rather overzealous example of Oakhaven's finest." Councilwoman Ramirez's eyes, when she looked up at Sergeant Miller, were like chips of ice. "Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I trust you are taking this matter with the extreme seriousness it warrants. Assaulting any citizen, particularly an elderly woman attempting to vote, is an outrage. But for Officer Baxter to lay hands on Augusta Mayfield—" She paused, letting the name hang in the air, her gaze sweeping over the now silent crowd. "For those of you who may not know," she continued, her voice rising, "the woman Officer Baxter just assaulted is not just Mrs. Augusta Mayfield, a respected elder of our community. She is the Augusta Mayfield, a pioneering foot soldier of the civil rights movement, a woman who faced down Bull Connor's dogs in Birmingham, who registered voters in Mississippi when it was a death sentence, who stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with Dr. King. This woman, this treasure of our city, this icon of American history, was just shoved by one of your officers for trying to vote, a right she nearly died fighting for." A collective gasp went through the gymnasium. The hidden power, the monumental truth of Augusta Mayfield's identity was now revealed, and the impact was stunning. Voters who had been merely angry were now aghast, horrified. The young man who had filmed the incident looked at Mrs. Mayfield with a newfound awe. Even Sergeant Miller seemed to pale further, if that were possible. He knew the name, of course. Her contributions were part of local and national legend. He just hadn't made the connection. Officer Baxter, overhearing Councilwoman Ramirez's words, looked as though he might faint. He had assaulted a registered voter. He had assaulted an elderly woman. But he had assaulted Augusta Mayfield, a living legend, a figure of almost untouchable moral authority. The full, crushing weight of his stupidity, his prejudice, his career-ending blunder, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just committed an assault. He had desecrated a monument. The repercussions, he now knew with sickening certainty, would be swift, severe, and utterly devastating. The story was no longer just about an aggressive cop and an elderly voter. It was about an attack on the very legacy of the civil rights movement, in a public polling place captured on video, and the city of Oakhaven was about to feel the thunder. The revelation of Mrs. Augusta Gus Mayfield's identity as a pivotal figure in the civil rights movement transformed the already volatile situation at the Lincoln Elementary polling station into a full-blown civic crisis. Councilwoman Ramirez's impassioned declaration hung in the air, electrifying the atmosphere. The name Augusta Mayfield, now imbued with its profound historical significance, resonated with everyone present, from the youngest poll worker to the most seasoned voters. This was no longer an isolated incident of an officer's bad temper. It was an assault on a living legend, a sacrilegious act against the very freedoms she had fought to secure. Sergeant Miller, his face ashen, immediately understood the seismic shift. He barked into his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "Dispatch, get me Deputy Chief Carmichael on the line, code 3, and notify the chief's office directly. We have a..." A highly sensitive officer-involved incident at Precinct 12 involving a prominent citizen, Mrs. Augusta Mayfield. Yes, the Augusta Mayfield. Situation critical. The news spread through the city's power structures with astonishing speed. The mayor's office was in an uproar. Police Chief Harrison, a man who had been trying to navigate the treacherous waters of police reform and community relations, felt a cold dread grip him. An assault on Augusta Mayfield by one of his officers on Election Day at a polling station. It was a public relations nuclear bomb. Back in the gymnasium, Officer Chad Baxter was a study in abject terror. The bravado, the arrogance, the sneering contempt, all had evaporated, leaving behind a trembling, pale young man who looked as though he was facing a firing squad. He kept muttering, I didn't know who she was," as if that could somehow excuse his brutality. Mr. Jenkins, the retired attorney, his voice stern, corrected him. "Officer, it shouldn't matter who she is. Your conduct would have been reprehensible had you assaulted any citizen, any voter. The fact that you assaulted Mrs. Augusta Mayfield, a woman of her stature and history, only magnifies the egregious nature of your offense and the depth of your incompetence and prejudice." Mrs. Mayfield, though still in discomfort, addressed Sergeant Miller, her voice regaining its quiet strength. "Sergeant, while I appreciate Councilwoman Ramirez's kind words, the issue here is not solely about my past. It is about the present. It is about the right of every citizen to vote without intimidation, without harassment, without fear of assault from those sworn to protect them. Officer Baxter attempted to deny me that right, and he physically assaulted me in the process. That is the core issue that must be addressed." Her words, calm and principled, even in the face of her own violation, seemed to galvanize the crowd further. Chants of "Baxter out" and "Justice for Mrs. Mayfield" began to ripple through the gymnasium. The young man who had filmed the incident was now live streaming, his feed being picked up by local news blogs and activist networks. The story was exploding online. "Stand with Gus Mayfield" was trending within minutes. Deputy Chief Paula Carmichael arrived on the scene with a grim expression, flanked by several internal affairs detectives. She was a highly respected black woman, a veteran officer who had risen through the ranks and had a no-nonsense reputation for integrity. She immediately took charge, her presence commanding respect. Her first act was to approach Mrs. Mayfield with profound deference. "Mrs. Mayfield," Deputy Chief Carmichael said, her voice filled with genuine concern and respect, "on behalf of the Oak Haven Police Department, I offer you our deepest, sincerest apologies for the disgraceful conduct of Officer Baxter. There are no words to adequately express our shame and regret for what you have endured today. Are you certain you do not require immediate medical attention?" "Thank you, Deputy Chief," Mrs. Mayfield replied, acknowledging her with a slight nod. "Your apology is a start. As for medical attention, I will be seeing my own physician later. Right now, what I require is to see justice done." And, she added, her eyes twinkling faintly despite her pain, "I still need to cast my vote." Deputy Chief Carmichael assured her that her right to vote would be immediately facilitated. She then turned her steely gaze upon Officer Baxter, who seemed to shrink under her scrutiny. "Officer Baxter," Carmichael said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Surrender your badge and service weapon to Sergeant Miller. You will be escorted to headquarters for a formal statement. An internal affairs investigation into your conduct has already commenced, and I assure you it will be swift, thorough, and impartial." The sight of Baxter, his face ashen, numbly unpinning his badge and handing over his weapon, was a stunning moment of immediate accountability. He was then escorted out of the gymnasium by two stern-faced IA detectives, past a gauntlet of glaring voters, his career in law enforcement effectively over. With Baxter removed, a semblance of order was restored, but the atmosphere remained charged. Poll workers, under the direction of a now composed Sarah and supervised by election officials who had rushed to the scene, found Mrs. Mayfield's registration. A simple clerical error had indeed been the initial issue and facilitated her vote. As Augusta Mayfield, civil rights legend, slowly and deliberately cast her ballot, a hush fell over the gymnasium, followed by a spontaneous, heartfelt round of applause. It was more than just a vote. It was an act of profound defiance, a testament to her unyielding spirit. The public condemnation of Baxter's actions and the OPD was overwhelming. The mayor issued a public apology. The city council scheduled an emergency session. Civil rights organizations, both local and national, released scathing statements, demanding not just Baxter's termination, but a full-scale review of OPD training, policies, and patterns of misconduct. The video of the shove, replayed endlessly on news channels and social media, became a symbol of police overreach and the ongoing struggle for voting rights and basic human dignity. The climax was not just Baxter's removal, but the citywide and indeed nationwide uproar that his single brutal act of prejudiced arrogance had unleashed. Oakhaven was in the eye of a storm, and at its calm, resolute center was Mrs. Augusta Gus Mayfield. The firing of Officer Chad Baxter was merely the opening salvo in a much larger battle for accountability and reform in Oakhaven. The image of him shoving Augusta Mayfield, a revered icon of the civil rights movement, as she attempted to exercise her hard-won right to vote, became an indelible stain on the city and its police department. The consequences rippled outward, touching every corner of civic life. The Oakhaven City Council, facing unprecedented public pressure and national media scrutiny, moved with uncharacteristic speed. In an emergency session, they unanimously passed a resolution formally apologizing to Mrs. Mayfield, condemning Baxter's actions, and committing to a comprehensive, independent review of the Oakhaven Police Department's policies, training protocols, and history of citizen complaints. They allocated emergency funding for enhanced voter education and poll worker training, specifically addressing de-escalation techniques and accommodations for elderly and disabled voters. Councilwoman Angela Ramirez spearheaded these efforts, working closely with Mrs. Mayfield and a coalition of community leaders and civil rights organizations. The internal affairs investigation into Chad Baxter concluded swiftly. Armed with the viral video, numerous eyewitness testimonies, and Baxter's own panicked, contradictory statements, they found him guilty of gross misconduct, excessive use of force, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violating Mrs. Mayfield's civil rights. He was summarily terminated from the OPD, his law enforcement career ending in utter disgrace. The district attorney's office, under intense public and political pressure, also filed criminal charges against Baxter for assault on an elderly individual. He eventually pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor assault charge, receiving probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent revocation of his peace officer certification, ensuring he could never again wear a badge in that state. But the impact went far beyond Baxter's personal downfall.